All right, I think we're there at about 34 attendees. Looks good. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Jan Beecher. I'm a commissioner at the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. I'm joined today by my interconnected colleagues, Chairman Wheel, Vice Chairman Arconti, and Commissioners Cheeseman and Smith. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second technical meeting in docket number 25-01-27, the Pura investigation into interconnection process modifications. As we know, flexible interconnection has the potential to significantly expand distributed energy resource hosting capacity across the state by dynamically adjusting resource output based on real-time grid conditions, rather than relying on static operating limits. Today's meeting will focus on the proposals of the United Illuminating Company and Eversource regarding flexible interconnection. These were filed with the authority on March 16, 2026 as motion 22 in this proceeding. In addition, we will address any other procedural or scheduling matters as we move toward the authority's final decision, which is tentatively scheduled for October 7th, 2026. Before we begin today's presentations, I'll review a few housekeeping items. First, all Pura proceedings are transcribed, and Teresa is our court reporter with us today. Thank you, Teresa. To help her maintain a clear and complete record, please identify yourself by name and affiliation each time you speak. Second, chat messages are not transcribed and thus not part of the official record, so we ask that you refrain from using the Zoom chat function. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand feature located under the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. Let me pause and just say, are there any administrative matters that any participants would like to raise at this time? See none. All right. So we have received comments in this docket and are looking forward to everyone's constructive engagement today. At this time, I'll turn the meeting over to Mr. Christopher Arpin of the Pura staff. He's our lead staff analyst for this docket. We also have other members of the Pura team who will also be participating on particular issues. And so, Chris, I'll hand it over to you, and Chris will review the agenda and get us going. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Commissioner Beecher, and thank you to all participants for joining today's technical meeting. At this time, the EDCs and Grid Edge networks are scheduled to present in that order. Following each presentation, the authority and stakeholders will have an opportunity to ask questions and engage in discussion. With that, I will turn the floor over to the EDCs, who will discuss in greater detail their flexible interconnection proposals.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing us to speak here today. We were hoping that someone from Pure staff may be able to share or to actually share the presentation for us, if that would be possible.
Case coordinator is doing that. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. And I believe Joe Debs is from Eversource.
Yes.
Is going to get us started here. Hey, Joe.
Good morning, all. Thank you all for having us. My name is Joseph Debs. I'm a project manager at Eversource, responsible for generator interconnection in Connecticut. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this is the meeting agenda today. We have an interconnection message, basically covering what we've done in the past. We'll cover all these items. It's important to understand that in some approaches, like the curtailment approach, UI and Eversource have different requirements, and so we'll both be speaking on this topic. When it comes to eligibility requirement, it will be a joint topic. So you will see us going back and forth on this project. So the first thing we're going to talk about is UI pilot program. Then we'll talk about eligibility requirement, curtailment, long-term planning, implementation timeline, cost recovery, and data access. At the conclusion of this, we will have a Q&A to answer any specific questions that you may have that we did not cover during this. Next slide, please. And UI, you're on.
Thanks, Joe. So I figured we'd start off with, just a really basic discussion here. as some of the people on the call may not be as familiar as we are, or some of the members of the working group and peer staff have been on these topics. So right off the bat, what are we talking about with flexible interconnection? So at a very basic level, we are talking about a way to increase hosting capacity. We are looking at a way that we can, without making significant system upgrades, bring more flexible energy, more DER energy onto the distribution system grid. So we started this working group. It was a result of the Sprint Docket 25-127, and it was final order number 4, which was issued in August of 2025. And this is just a very small snippet of the order that I placed here. It's a much longer order than this, but I think it's a very important sentence, and it's shall submit for the authority's review and approval a proposal for allowing flexible interconnections, including at a minimum smart inverters, interconnecting load, interconnecting generation, and energy storage to be implemented in Connecticut. So we actually started this development of this program pretty much immediately after the interim order came out, and I believe that was in March of 2025, or maybe even some of that might have been May. I apologize. But immediately, Eversource and UI, we started working together to kind of game plan, how we were going to comply with this order, what we needed to do, and we pretty quickly brought this discussion to the Sprint working group. And we developed a sub-working group with additional meetings from members of that group. Essentially, we opened it up to anyone who was interested in joining. And we did get some really good feedback from many of those members. So I think it is worth saying, kind of right off the bat here, we do thank you very much to all the working group members that participated and provided feedback for us. It is extremely important. We are unable to do this without understanding developer needs. I think that is one of the key points here, because at the end of the day, a flexible IX program is reliant on it being useful for developers to actually get interconnected. So without making it make sense for them, it doesn't make sense for Connecticut. So I think the follow-up point here too is we really want to continue to develop this, and we are hopeful to keep this working group going. And we kind of want to echo the call for anyone who has participated or hasn't but would like to, that we do welcome your input, and we do want to keep going and have some continuous improvement on this process, because both EDCs, we do believe this is a very important program, but we also believe it's important to get it right. So next slide, please. So kind of to follow up on getting the baseline set here, we developed 2 very specific definitions. This is one of the first things we did with the working group. And we did this because there are a lot of discussions going around, and it was important for us to level set on what flexible interconnection was. So we're talking about 2 very specific, similar but different things. So flexible interconnection, as we describe it and use that term, we are talking about utilizing utility-owned and operated real-time DER control to automatically manage DER outputs. So this is what we talk about, where the utility essentially has a DERMS or some other similar capability that can essentially actively dispatch or curtail a developer's generation resource based on real-time grid constraints. The second definition is for a scheduled flexible interconnection or a scheduled interconnection. And this concept is similar, except instead of having real-time management, you're usually utilizing a predetermined time-varying limit. So this is sort of a go-between between just traditional firm hosting capacity and a real-time managed output, to where you are developing essentially a generation curve based on average real-time or average historic or forecasted data. And you're essentially increasing that hosting capacity under that curve by allowing the generator to go higher than the minimum firm limit. So if I can draw your attention to the 2 graphs on the right side of the page, the bottom graph is a pretty simplistic view, but the green line there would be the conventional or traditional firm hosting capacity limits. So if you consider it to be base load, right? Typically it's late at night. Depending on, the circuit and the substation, things can change based on, highly commercial areas or not. But late at night, the DER capacity is limited to the lowest load on that circuit. However, if you look at the graph above, what you're able to do with flexible is you're able to keep that DER and allow that DER to approach the actual capacity curve. So you're no longer artificially limited by just that max output, right? That daily max, and you're able to increase the amount of DER pretty substantially that's available to be interconnected in any particular constraint, whether it be a circuit or a substation. Scheduled IX gets you sort of in between those two, because with scheduled, you do still have to manage a somewhat safety margin or a safety buffer, because you are making assumptions based on what the daily curve and effects of that actual load would be. So you do still have to do, you have to maintain a level of margin to ensure that you're not going over, right? Because you no longer have that ability to actively control. Whereas with full flexible, you don't really need to plan a buffer. You can use a buffer for your analysis, for your curtailment analysis, and for a developer to understand their expectations of what they can actually generate, but they're not curtailed unless they're absolutely needed to be curtailed. So you're no longer curtailing in advance or proactively, you're curtailing reactively. So next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about what UI has proposed. And Joe will follow up with Eversource's proposal. So we do have, essentially based on the differences in our systems, a different approach here. And primarily, UI is a much smaller territory. Our load is much more concentrated to specific areas. We have significantly less customers and less substations and less circuits than Eversource has. So with our system, the availability of telemetry and system data and AMI systems that we have, we feel that we can get to a flexible interconnection program fairly quickly, following up on a Puro order. However, we're not necessarily suggesting that we should jump ahead and do that immediately. But this is where we're looking at a way for us to kind of get started and pilot the concepts based on things that we've done and our sister company has done up in New York as well. And we're considering, well, if we were going to roll this out, how would we do it? So the first idea would be to identify an area or a location for a pilot, based on hosting capacity demand. So ideally, if we're going to try this, we're going to try it somewhere where it's useful. Looking at our system, we have, somewhere around 20% of our circuits have below 5 megawatts of hosting capacity. We have no substation level constraint that would automatically get below that level today. So the constraints are relatively localized. But the concept would be to identify a location. I said that generators here would be chosen on a first come, first served basis, but this is all essentially based on queue order. So identifying a location, looking at the queue, seeing where a project has been proposed that would be a candidate for this, in which a flexible IX could be used instead of requiring significant investment either by the company or by the developer themselves. And get the developers buy-in on essentially becoming a part of the pilot. I think that's important as well. So this would require us to deploy utility grid terms. This is essentially what we've discussed in our presentation, in our proposal as our minimum requirements for implementation. Essentially, it's using a monitoring and control the DER with a gateway device and controlling the system, based on actual measured constraints at the time. So the necessary investment on the part of the developer, we talked about, and we'll talk a little bit later about the suggested size for these projects and the threshold. This is a similar requirement as today is what we would require a developer to have for SCADA communication. So we're getting up over that 500 kW threshold. And there are costs associated that would be needed for the developer to pay to be able to utilize this program. So, we are kind of suggesting a threshold, but it's not necessarily a hard limit on our end. It's more of what we see as a practical limit based on the cost. So we can go to the next slide and Joe can talk about their program. Oh, you're muted, Joe.
Yeah, I just realized that. Thank you. Eversource doesn't have a pilot program, but we'll cover what we're proposing in the next slide. We early on when we start looking at this, we talked about what is a reasonable kilowatt limit to use, and we knew back then that we would need some sort of DER gateway to conduct this. And based on the information that's available today to us, a DR gateway cost is about 75 plus. So in some cases, it could be over 75K. And based on that information, we felt that, and we had a brief discussion with the work group, we felt that anything below 500 kilowatt with that cost base is not practical. That's the rationale why we picked 500. Now, we do believe and we do support investigating lower threshold to 250, but that would require us to investigate a DR gateway that is probably lower in cost and still meet the EDC technical requirements. The recommendation at this point is that this should be discussed with a work group, and we could work through them and make a final determination and identify a method or DR gateway that can be used to perform this task. Next slide, please. The curtailment approach for both UI and Eversource is different. So UI will cover the curtailment approach in their case, but in our case, we realized that to do a full flexible interconnection, we would need a DERMS and a DMS system, which we currently don't have in Connecticut. And so the question become, what is the easiest thing to do in the interim? And we picked scheduled flexible interconnection, which is very similar to the battery interconnection, where we have a schedule that we provide to developer. The schedule, you could look at it in Exhibit B of our technical requirements, where it has published schedule. So we expect to have an identical or similar schedule. The curtailment will be based on queue position. So when we conduct the study, we'll base it on the queue position, and we'll provide developers with a schedule of curtailment. The schedule looks something like maybe in the summer, during certain time of the day, you could work and generate 100% of your nameplate rating, but at other time you will curtail. The benefit of a curtailment schedule is it provides a fixed schedule. It's easy to estimate the total production of a generator, and it's a good way to implement something fairly quickly while waiting for a ADMS and a DERM system to be implemented in the Eversource territory. Now, UI, you're next for curtailment.
Sure. So, following up on, oh, can you hear me okay? So, following up here on our pilot approach, we're talking about essentially doing only a real-time active management. So the curtailment basis is essentially near real time as needed on the system. So you are only curtailed if you absolutely need to be. That is kind of the first concept. So this is the way that you get to essentially unlocking the most hosting capacity. In terms of the methodology for the principles of access, our recommendation is to use what we were calling the vintaging approach. And we discussed this quite a bit in the proposal, but essentially the way that this works is it's sort of a hybrid combination between two basic principles. So if you think about our DERQ today, that essentially is a kind of a last in first out approach, but essentially you're based on order of application. Now, what we do, or what we're suggesting that we would do here for flexible, is essentially identifying a allocation of flexible capacity. And that allocation would be for, say, the first vintage. And that first vintage would be essentially all projects that are applying under a certain constraint location, potentially within a time frame. So you could say, okay, up to 1 year of applications coming on until this date at this location would be vintage together. Or you could do it based on a capacity limit. You could say the next 5 megawatts of interconnection that are proposed here at this constraint are going to be considered in that first vintage. And what happens then from that point is any of the projects that are assigned in that vintage, they get curtailed on a pro rata basis. So based on their proportional share of that capacity bucket. So if it's a 5 megawatt capacity limit and you have a 2 megawatt or 2.5 megawatt, we'll make the math easier, generator, you are going to share in 50% of that curtailment requirement. And essentially what this does is it allows generators of varying sizes to be practical. So if you consider purely on a last in first out basis, this makes it very difficult for smaller generators that come in later to be able to generate in a more predictable manner, right? You're essentially, if you assign them immediate curtailment responsibility, you are taking them potentially to zero every time that you have a curtailment requirement. Whereas with a vintaging approach or a pro rata approach, you can share that need, and essentially you allow for what we feel would be more predictability, but also practicality for more generators to be on the system at that same time. So by doing so, you're creating a way in which it's predictable, in which the individual projects that are or applications or applicants that are on this particular vintage can understand how they'll be curtailed. They can estimate based on the system and based on expectations how often they'll be curtailed and how much. But you also allow it to be not indeterminate. So by closing that vintage, you're essentially saying, okay, you guys are the first in, you're the first group. Here's your expectation. You open it up to a second vintage because maybe there is more capacity there, or maybe capacity changes. There may be additional capacity that gets added down the line. What then happens is that second vintage, inside that group, they're curtailed in the same manner as the first vintage, but they are curtailed first. So now that second vintage, that later group that comes in, they own that responsibility and have to go to 100% before that first vintage is curtailed at all. So it allows those projects that come in earlier to still have that advantage, right? Because essentially you don't want to punish, and you can't punish a project that's been online for 10 years because a new project wants to come in and all of a sudden wants to use capacity that they were using, right? So it kind of allows you to have this sort of a fair manner in which it's the way it's in which it's allocated, but also in a way that allows for multiple locations to be in the service in service at once. So we kind of see this as a way to maximize the available flexible capacity and a way to ensure that it gets utilized, in the best way possible. So in terms of the implementation path, we see this as something that would use very basically the same requirements and the same system requirements as a scheduled interconnection at scale. We believe that we could begin a pilot program with DERMS deployment on a similar timeline as it would take for us to implement scheduled interconnections as well. Now, that's primarily a different case than Eversource. The main reason being the changes or differences in our system that I discussed earlier. And essentially a large part of the delay in this deployment is really related to system process changes, planning methodologies, the need to kind of reanalyze and decide how we approach these things on what I would say kind of our back end, right? So the need to understand how we're going to identify these things, how they're going to fit into long-term capacity planning, how curtailment analysis are going to be completed, because even though we're doing real-time curtailment, developers still needs to have an analysis and understand what that curtailment may look like for them in order for them to identify if the project makes sense. So we see a lot of the same work happening for both programs at UI, and essentially we feel that by skipping the scheduled interconnection path for us, we'd be able to get to a more later stage approach quicker, if that makes sense. So next slide, please.
Oh, I'm gonna vomit.
All right.
Was there a question there? All right, I think Steve is going to take this one over.
All right, yeah, I will start as Steve Osech from Eversource, Distribution System Planning Manager. and I'll trade off with UI. We have some differences in the way we do planning now. So I will start off with Eversource. At this time, when we plan DER for our system planning projects, we're taking all of the DER that we have telemetry on, and we actually remove it to try and look back at a gross load for our system and account for gross load when we do capacity projects. The reason we do this is because these are not assets that are within our operational control, and we don't want to rely on them to manage our system. So what we're looking at with this program is we're hoping, of course, subject to regulatory alignment with a program that works for us to use these as assets in our favor. We're hoping that we can evolve to the long-term vision that we've laid out here. And at that, I can hand it over to UI, who can talk through the bullet points of where we'd like to go with.
Sure. So, essentially, as he mentioned, there is a balancing act here with how do you approach a flexible asset when it comes down to capacity planning, for example. I think that's probably the biggest case. Ideally, for this project or this program works, right? You want to see benefits not only for developers to get more generation on, but also for ratepayers, right? You want to see a benefit to ratepayers. You want to see deferment. You want to see reduction in capital costs and investment costs needed to keep the grid going. Now, how this looks and how this works, we really don't know yet. It is one of the bigger questions kind of surrounding this for us. And it is one of the reasons that, we are kind of cautioning and asking for further development of this program. But there is a fairly important elephant in the room that the complexity that flexible interconnections create make modeling more difficult. It makes planning more difficult, and it makes understanding how these things are going to affect the system in the future more difficult. Now, to go along with that, a DERM system also has significant advantages for planning, because now it opens up the possibilities of seeing significantly more data, and also seeing how these things are affecting a lot of our assumptions, right? So now we're going to be able to integrate with ADMS, to integrate with AMI, potentially to utilize software that can take this information and can provide very high level analyses for us that maybe in the past would have taken us a significant amount of time, but can be done much quicker. These are a lot of ifs. There's a lot more work to do on this front. We feel that there's a lot more research that we need to do. And there's also a lot of different software solutions and a lot of different programs out there that can approach these things in different ways. So we are kind of looking at what other companies have been doing, and we're trying to look at the market and see what's available. And we're hoping that, the rollout of this program will essentially work together and harmonize with these upgrades and allow us to get to a place in the future where these projects, where this program can actually help facilitate, speed things up, and hopefully make things less expensive as well. So next slide, please.
Okay. When it comes to implementation timeline, both Eversource and UI have different timeline implementation, primarily because Eversource doesn't have an ADMS or DERM system implemented. And for full implementation of flexible interconnection, those are needed. And we expect that would require PURA's approval, and it would take approximately 2 years to implement this process before we could be used for flexible interconnection. In the interim, as we discussed earlier, Eversource is proposing scheduled interconnection. Implementing scheduled interconnection is a 3 to 6 months lead time, and for Eversource, it means that we have to do some work in PowerClerk, just make sure we could support this. But also we have to look at we'll be doing some of the time series analysis, and we need to set those up in our load flow tool to make sure that we could do those and assess the impact on the distribution system. So this is a 3 to 6 months process. And I think as UI mentioned earlier, it will take about 6 months for them as well, unless UI, you have anything to add on your timelines.
Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so similarly with Joe, I think we projected in the proposal approximately 7 months after approval, we believe we could begin accepting a flexible application. This is a fairly aggressive timeline that we've proposed here. However, I do want to qualify this that what we really are suggesting, and we've been trying to echo, is that we don't feel this is ready to be rolled out. We do think there is a significant amount of work that has to be done. This is sort of a identified here as a if needed, this is we believe the fastest we could go, if that makes sense. So we have essentially here a timeline where we're looking at receiving applications around 7 months with the actual final site energized at a minimum of around 15 months. But generally speaking, we believe these timelines towards the end would actually be probably driven by the project itself, by the developer and the timeline it takes for them to get their project online. Now, this is again based on peer approval, cost recovery happening, and allowing us to move forward with a utility grid DERM system. This is based on the system that's been piloted by our sister companies in New York. We do have some history with this. Now, there are other competing platforms out there, and there is more work that needs to be done to confirm if this is the platform that we would want to use. But it is based on something that we have a little bit of experience with. We have piloted the technology through the IES program at UI, but not in a flexible interconnection manner, just in the ability to kind of monitor. But we have seen it work. That being said, we really don't believe we're ready on the policy side in terms of the interconnection guidelines, how this is going to work. And what we want to do is we want to ensure that by the time we roll this out, we have something very solid that will work for us and for the developer and for the ratepayer, but also, keep working and not require significant changes once it's already been put into place. So, next slide, please.
Cost recovery. When it comes to cost recovery, you have to consider two costs. The first one is a cost associated with a specific interconnection project. And that would mean that any study cost, upgrade cost, and in this case, the RTEC or the DDR gateway costs. Those costs are well defined in the interconnection guidelines and are the responsibility of the developer of the project. So there's no concern with these costs. This is business as usual. There are other costs, specifically the DERM and the ADMS cost. These costs would require pure approval, and these costs could be recovered through each EDC non-bypassable federally mandated congestion charges as part of the annual RAM process. This is consistent with other docket, specifically 250127 and 260104. It's also consistent with the treatment of other DER pilot investment project where PURA has agreed to include these costs in the FMCC cost at the rate cases. So these are the two costs that we identified. Next slide, please. Data access. So this is the information that would be made available to developer to help them plan their project. And on May 6, Eversource updated their old hosting capacity to a new map. That new map includes a lot more information that was not included in the old maps. That it is the information that would be available to the developer. That information includes the hosting capacity for the circuit and the substation, as well as the parcel itself. It would also include time series analysis data that can be used for schedules. It also include a load data, or what we refer to as a headroom data. That headroom data essentially is what can be used for battery installation, but also EV and electric cars and that kind of nature to plan their work. So the new hosting capacity maps have a lot of information, and the recommendation is that we review the data we are providing to developer to understand if that data is sufficient and identify the needs. And UI have a different hosting capacity map, so I will let them comment on that.
Thanks, Joe. So yeah, similarly, we certainly understand the need that there will be additional data that needs to be made public, further than the basic firm capacity levels that our hosting capacity maps provide today. That being said, we currently do not have this capability within our existing mapping. From my understanding, it can be added. There will be costs associated with doing so. And again, this would be another cost that we would um, suggest would be recovered through the RAM process that was mentioned on the previous slide. And I did want to note that there is a hosting capacity map upgrade project underway at UI right now. However, any upgrades for a flexible interconnection program are not identified in that current project. So, there still will be additional costs that would need to be added. I don't think it would be a substantial number, but it is worth mentioning that, this is a good example of sort of that back end support and upgrade costs that are needed to make this program work. And, following up on our general recommendation here is we really need to find the balancing point between what developers need to see, what needs to be made public, and also what cannot be made public due to potential harm it could cause. So whether that be harm to the distribution system because we're providing essentially information that could be used in a manner to damage the system potentially, or could provide essentially sensitive data or confidential data for our customers, right? We don't want to be releasing information about a circuit that could potentially expose a large commercial customer, and provide, what is essentially, trade information for them, right? Their costs of running and their costs of operation may be very sensitive and could be highly reliant on electricity usage. So there's a balancing act here. We obviously want to provide as much information as possible, but we also want to make sure that we're not providing too much information. Next slide.
Okay, this is the last slide in our deck, and fundamentally, one of the things we learned with the work group and looking at what other states were doing is flexible interconnection is really important, but it's also in the early stages in many states. I think California is the only state that really have something substantial. Everybody else is in the early stages. And so we felt it was necessary not to conclude the task force or the work group work, and we proposed that we continue the work group at least until March 2027. We also proposed a framework for this work group, and we could meet to discuss this work group. I think we scheduled the first meeting June 30th or toward the end of June. But fundamentally, some of the key component of the work group would be first to address some of the stakeholder comment that came late in the game. Earthlight technology, I think they're important comment to address. So we will address them. Another important aspect of the proposed framework is recognizing that Eversource operate in 3 states, and Massachusetts has a collaborative effort. And so as a company, from an efficiency point of view, we want to make sure that we harmonize our flexible interconnection requirement with our sister companies. I'm sure UI wants to do that with New York as well. It just makes things much smoother for the whole company. That's an important aspect of things, is harmonizing and working closely with Massachusetts in our case. We wanted to further discuss the principle of operation and make sure that we dig deeper into this. This is also another topic that came up late in the game because it's in the early stages. I'm not going to go through all of them. Probably one of the important topics in here is also the consideration for system less than 500 kilowatt, 250 kilowatt to 500 kilowatt, where we don't have a firm DR gateway. We need to review those. review the requirement, address some of the security issues associated with the DR gateway that a smaller DR may have. So these are important topic we need to discuss. And basically, the goal here is to meet with the whole team, with a work group, review that framework, adjust it as needed based on the need, and move forward with regular meetings. On that, I think this concludes our presentation. I'd like to thank the Commissioner and Pura staff for having us present in front of you. We can move to the Q&A part of this presentation.
Thanks very much. I see a couple hands up. Justin Deigel.
Hey everyone, thank you so much. Joe, really appreciate Joe and Robert, really appreciate everything you guys put together here. I think it does definitely provide us with some good options to move forward with flexible interconnections. Joe did mention Earthlight. I did have a couple of questions that I sent out earlier as of last week. Definitely stuff that we can work on throughout the continuing of the flexible interconnection working group. I think if that meeting is in June, I would definitely love to be a part of that and continue to have these discussions. I think for all intents and purposes, like the 3 to 6 months rollout for scheduled IX, really what we're looking at trying to do is get some questions answered on that stuff to keep those projects moving forward. Specifically, I had a question about data access when it comes to the time series data for those scheduled interconnections. Should that load analysis be studied at the circuit level, the substation level, and as we submit our applications for those flexible interconnections? And obviously Power Clerk's going to have to get updated, and there's going to be needing to be some changes in there, but we still have options, and I think there's some things that we should tweak to better help provide you guys with the information to get these projects into the queue and reviewed, and with the information that you guys need so that we can have successful reviews. So I'll just throw that back to y'all guys if you can give me an answer on that.
Any reactions?
I think, Jay, well, thank you for the question. I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I could address some of this. When we conduct a study, we conduct a review with the impact the system will have on both the circuit and the substations. So that's something that is part of the study. I haven't had a chance to review all your questions specific to a project, but I'll certainly could catch up with you after the meeting. I don't like to discuss specific project related on a meeting open to the public, just in case we say other things. But if you have a specific question that need clarification, it would be helpful.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. Like, I think it has a lot to do with the interconnection hosting capacity map updates that came out earlier in the month. And there's really not too much guidance on how to use that data. And my question was mainly around, like, if we're doing if we're trying to do a scheduled interconnection, is the circuit level capacity headroom and capacity, or is it based on the substation level headroom and capacity?
Okay. The first thing I want to ask you to do is to make sure that there's a work group meeting on June 2nd that would go over a training session for the hosting capacity map. Make sure you're on that list.
Yes,
I
sure.
will try to address your specific question at the work group. I'll coordinate with the presenter and see if we could add some slide to help you with this. That is something I could do. So what I'll do is I'll catch up with you after the meeting. We'll go over your questions, and if we could present those at the training session, we will.
Excellent.
Make sense?
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Joe.
Okay.
Appreciate you.
Sounds
Okay.
like a plan. Thank you so much. Commissioner Cheeseman.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Beecher. Thank you all for your presentation. So question, and if I don't know if you're able to answer this. So your two discussions about the size of the project, 500 kW and then looking at 250. What's the universe in terms of availability for projects and developers of this size?
So this is Rob Susanos from UI. Thank you for your question. Could I kind of follow up your question with another question, I guess? When you say a universe, do you mean, how the number of projects that we see, or are we talking about, the range of projects and just want to make sure I understand correctly.
So, I mean, I suppose it twofold. How many people approach you for something like this, and what's the, if everybody who was eligible to participate in this participated, what would the numbers be? I mean, are we looking at 20 projects? Are we looking at 200? Just I'm trying to get a sense of the scale here.
Okay, so I think that's probably a really difficult question for us to answer. Generally speaking, we do see a lot of projects over the 250 kW size. It's very common for large commercial buyout projects to be, over 500, over a megawatt, fuel cell projects, up over 2, 3 megawatts as well. At UI, we don't have hundreds of those projects, but we do typically see, and I'm going to throw out a very uninformed guess here without looking at numbers, but I would suggest we probably see in the ballpark of a dozen applications a month come in for large projects, of that, up over 500, say. That being said, the likelihood or the practicality of these projects fitting into this mold for the near term is probably somewhat small, because it's really limited based on the constraints that we have. I think in our recent interrogatories, UI responded that we have somewhere around 25 circuits. I'm going to get this exact number wrong, but somewhere around 25 circuits in the under 5 megawatt threshold. And the way we were approaching this kind of initial program would be that we would identify these flexible eligible locations based on that threshold. So we would essentially choose a limit. 5 megawatts was kind of an arbitrary limit that was chosen, but essentially a number where it would make sense to start looking at a flexible interconnection rather than continuing to only look at firm. And essentially, you open it up in that manner to where we would then need a developer who was willing or looking to propose a project on that circuit, right? So obviously developers have a significant number of needs that go into an analysis, that go into choosing where they're going to try and put a project in. If I'm a developer, I'm going to be looking for firm capacity first. However, there may be existing projects on these circuits that want to increase in size, for example. There may be projects today in which they wanted to put in a larger farm, but were limited in size, and they have the land and the availability to increase, and flexible becomes a way for that to happen. So I think there's a very big, or very large opportunity here for a lot of projects to come into play. At UI, for example, and I'll let Eversource, kind of discuss from their perspective as well. I don't think it's a hundreds of projects per year situation yet. I do think, though, as time goes on and as penetration increases, without making changes, that the firm capacity is going to go down. So there is a reality that eventually flexible interconnection will be a significant, or could be a significant quantity of the interconnection applications that we receive. So I hope I answered that question. I apologize that I couldn't really give you concrete numbers.
Thank you. That helps. And it just, one, knowing the scale, both in terms of, what is actually out there, what is realistically out there, and, given the costs that are going to be incurred, what are we looking at? And at the end of the day, a significant cost benefit analysis, how much, increase in other, hard capacity are we avoiding by looking at this? But I'd be interested to hear from Eversource if they could weigh in.
I do agree with Robert. This is a bit of a dynamic change as the penetration of DER continues to increase in Connecticut. We're going to see more and more constraint, and at that point, most of our project would become uh, would become flexible interconnection, and that may line up with the fact that if in 2 years or so we have a DERM system, that would be much easier to implement. The difficulty here is performing an analysis to assess that is really, really time consuming. It will take a very long time for us to do. And it's really not a good, easy way to predict this. Another factor goes into predicting how much generation we're going to see, including incentives. So I see that as we could predict the future, that the number of flexible interconnection will become much higher over the next few years. Identify how much higher and the quantity is a much more difficult task.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I'll just add to Joe saying, I think we do need to get some history with the program because we have no backup data. And I think that's really what both Rob and Joe are trying to say. But the one point I wanted to make from at least a technical magnitude, maybe it helps paint a picture in your head of the value of the program, is on a very high level, you have to keep in mind when we do projects now, we're looking at the worst case scenario for capacity. And what this program attempts to gain is the best case scenario for capacity. So by allowing this flexible, there's a lot of area under that curve of capacity that we can fill in that we've otherwise turned people away for. So,
All right. Thank you. Thank you
Thank-
for your answer. Thank you, Commissioner Beecher.
Thanks very much. Commissioner Smith.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm just curious whether you've had any conversations with the developers, or if you have any insight into from the developer into how they think on what happens to the economics under this sort of program when you increase plant size and then curtail. So one would be the economics of the developer, and secondly, is there any feedback as to what their financing sources, how they would feel about the additional curtailment risk in this sort of scenario? Thank you.
That's a question we had. How much is reasonable curtailment for a project? And that's probably one of the most difficult question to answer for developers. They haven't been able to answer this. I think that's because this is still in the early stages. I'm hoping that the next go around with a work group, that developer could come up, and maybe Mike Trahan could answer that question. But if you're putting a 2 MW project, how much curtailment is reasonable? And that's a financial question that only a developer could answer. But it's an important part of the equation because it helps us assess what's reasonable curtailments. Because right now we could only guess.
Yeah, it'll also go to how successful the program will be, based upon the economic profiles of the projects.
Right.
I'll just jump in there too and say I think the important thing for us is to find a way in which we can also provide them with certainty. And again, I'd also echo from Mike or maybe Noel to kind of follow up on our answers here from their perspective. But part of our goal is to find that balance point where we can create certainty for them and give them a curtailment analysis that is realistic, and that they would be able to do their financial calculations on ahead of time.
Okay, since his name came up, would Mr. Trahan like to comment on this particular question?
Sure. Good morning. Thank you for the question, Commissioner. We haven't had a chance to talk to. I've had a chance to talk to some developers regarding what sort of costs they may have been built into their project to address potential issues, cost issues like this. But as Joe and you had mentioned, it's really going to be project dependent, and so we're sort of in a holding pattern, waiting to understand what sort of costs would be involved ahead of time. I'm also interested to know a little bit more about that the cost will be borne by developers compared to other discussions that have been had in the past on other infrastructure upgrade issues where the costs are shared based on who benefits. So I'm interested in participate in the working group with Joe to kind of flesh those issues out in the future. Noel Lafayette is a financial guy, so he'll be able to answer some of the numbers, maybe answer that question more definitively. I did though want to ask Joe, if I did see the interrogatory responses in which the substations were listed that had or were near capacity, would those be the locations where you would be thinking about them as being substations for candidates for flexible interconnection? Would that be the same list?
Uh, that's a good question. I don't know that that would be limited to these substations. The intent with the DERM system is to implement it throughout the whole state, so as a substation reaches its capacity, it would easily be implemented.
Thanks, Joe. And if, I'm sorry, I can't provide more definitive numbers. I suspect that Noel Lafayette, who's in line after me, probably could.
All right, I'll take a chance and I'll keep bumping the chairman to hear from Mr. Lafayette.
Okay. Thank you for the time to speak. Great presentation, gentlemen. I really appreciated it. Very clear, very concise, and it's a positive step forward. The ball is beginning to roll, so I'm glad to see that. From a finance perspective, what banks, investors, developers need is a certain amount of certainty. Now, as Joe has said, that's project dependent. What's a reasonable amount of curtailment? So to me, the answer to that is to have a range. So a worst case on an annual basis. So in a worst case scenario, it will be curtailed. I'm making this number up 10% of the time. In a good year, it'll be 2% of the time. If that range is there, we will model our economics based on the worst case scenario. And if the numbers work, they work. But that needs to be contracted over a duration of time to do that. But if it's a range, that gives some flexibility because, as Joe Debs has said, and I've seen it, sometimes you don't know until you know. But contractually, that's what makes a project bankable. We go on the worst case scenario, and if the numbers work, we go from there. So that's, I think everybody will wind up at that model. Two, to address two other things. One, it's the shared cost thing. I've been in this business a long time, and I've been here from the beginning. And there's always an argument on if a circuit is upgraded with fresh three-phase or a substation is upgraded, whatever infrastructure is upgraded, anyone who touches it benefits from it. But historically, the developer has borne 100% of those costs. We cannot continue to do that simply because the ITC going away is already putting things under pressure. And as these costs go up, it's just too much to bear. Even if the technology is there, and even if the EDCs come up with a perfect plan, if the numbers don't work, they don't work. And this has been that umbrella discussion has been going on for a decade, and we need to kind of get clear on that now that Pura is fully staffed with fresh commissioners. We need to address that for the next 10 years. And the third one, I would say, and Joe Debs is correct, you don't know until you know, but there could be a reasonable amount of regulation on the cost. So if the EDCs tell me, okay, this is going to be $100,000, that all we know is what they tell us. And so it'd be nice to see some type of regulatory oversight on when we get hit with these upgrade costs. Now you can't say, okay, you can't spend more than $100,000, but there can be a range, there can be some type of workable formula that Pura can oversee. What we've seen in the last couple of years, it's not anybody's fault, it's just what happened is, we're told interconnection is going to be $200,000, and then the interconnection is installed, and all of a sudden we get hit with a bill for $400,000. Okay, that's after it's built. So that kind of thing, there's just not room for that sort of thing anymore with the ITC gone. So whatever we do here as this unfolds, whether it's shared costs or this, we do need regulatory oversight and price controls out of Pura. It's the only way we know. Otherwise, it's too many moving pieces and it creates uncertainty and it scares away investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe Mr. Arpin will be leading some additional discussion in that area as we move through the agenda. Commissioner Smith, did you have a follow-up to what we were just talking about?
I did. Thank you, Commissioner Beecher. So Mr. Lafayette just, I think, introduced for the first time that I've heard the concept of contractual minimum and maximum curtailment levels. And I was curious whether the utilities had taken that into account or considered it, and what that would do to this sort of program. Thank you.
Yeah, I can provide a quick answer for that. So it is a discussion that came up in the working group where developers want certainty, and the problem for us is we want to provide them certainty, but there is also a difficult discussion around it's not possible for us to guarantee certainty. There's a lot of things that can change in the system that are outside of our control. The weather, right, is a really basic example, but it's not possible for us to financially provide certainty, because essentially that would also mean ratepayers potentially providing that certainty, which at the end of the day, the developers is the one who is benefiting the most, right, from their own project. They are doing this as a for-profit enterprise. So there is a certain amount of risk that we expect that they would need to take on, and that we don't think we could take on for them. That being said, we want to act as a partner, right? We want to make sure that the value and the data that we provide them is reasonable and allows them to make good financial decisions and allows their project to be successful, because ultimately their success is good for the system. It is good for the ratepayer. It is good for them. So there is a shared responsibility in getting that information, but there is a very hard stop that we have to take in terms of finding a way to provide any sort of financial guarantee. I mean, we don't do that today, with firm capacity projects either. There is always a risk that something can happen, right? The system can have a failure which occurs that causes the developer to be shut off for a period of time that may be detrimental to their financial model. Obviously, we don't want those things to happen, but there is always the possibility of it. So.
All right, thank you. At long last, Chairman Wheel.
Thank you. Good morning. Excuse me. I had a question about the utilities proposal to recover their capital costs through the MBFs and MCC. Why wouldn't it sounds to me like this is just utility plant? Why wouldn't this just be in regular rate base? Like, why would it be through a reconciling mechanism?
Hi, Michael Shallance, Manager of Revenue Requirements for Eversource. I can maybe answer that. So I think it would be recovered through a rate case, but it's just that when costs, when a new program comes into play between rate cases, we would, the past history has been that we have been allowed to recover a new program, an incremental program in the non-bypassable FMCC. That's what happened with the DER portal and the DER map at the time of, I think it was in 2017, 2018 timeframe. That was a new program. It was between rate cases, so they allowed it there. But then it could be rolled into rate base at the next opportunity or the next rate case.
Thanks. But that didn't happen with those capital projects, right? Like the DER portal and the DER map, and I think UI has a bunch of capital projects still recovered through the RAM. Those haven't been rolled into rate base yet. Is that correct?
So those programs, from Eversource perspective, so the rate case was happening at about the time that program was being approved. So it was very, very close in timing. Then the rate case, the settlement occurred without incorporating those costs. So those investments were then recovered through the non-bypassable FMCC. Those two investments had a very short depreciable life, 5 years, I believe. So that is why they didn't make it to the next rate case, at which point they could have been incorporated.
And would this plant be ineligible? I know the ESI is statutorily retiring as of the Eversource's next rate case, which is pending, but would this plant not be eligible for recovery through the ESI? But to be transparent, my concern, I don't like seeing plants across reconciling mechanisms. It doesn't make sense to me that we're paying for depreciation and the return on investment through bypassable pass-through mechanisms. So I'm not a fan of the idea of the companies recovering plants specifically through the MBF MCC. Is there a reason why this wouldn't qualify for the ESI?
Well, under the current settlement, I believe the ESI is it must be core capital. So I'm not sure if these would be considered core capital investments. it sounds like, but if they were defined as core capital, then they could potentially go through the ESI. But the other thing to keep in mind, though, that the way the current ESI operates is that it's only the first 300 million, and the capital program is much larger than 300 million. These investments wouldn't necessarily be recovered in the ESI under the current framework.
Okay. And is the proposal for recovery through the NBFMCC, would that be like a prospective proposal, like where the company would be seeking recovery in the rate period in which, like the prospective rate period in which the plant would be entering service, or would these projects, like the IT work, already be done? But have you put any thought into like at what rate period the recovery would be sought?
Well, I think that we've only ever put the capital in rates when it's in service. So that it would be when it was placed in service.
Okay. I had one other quick question, sort of off topic, but maybe for the developers. I heard a bunch of references from Mr. Trahan, I think, about cost sharing. Was that a reference to like cost sharing between developers and the utilities for necessary upgrades?
Good morning, Chairman. I was when I heard the reference made that this would be a developer 100% cost, I just remember back to a precedent on at least on the residential side, where some costs, some infrastructure upgrade costs at the residential level are shared. There's a formula for that that's currently in place. And I know there's been discussion in the infrastructure modification docket also about shared costs. And the point that I just want to drive home is that the fairness involved, or the fairness issue, is something that we'd like to be considered, that everybody who benefits should pay based on the percentage that they benefit by. That's all.
Well, yeah, and I was wondering about that. The benefit you're referencing, is it the benefit of the increased capacity specifically on the circuit, or the benefit of like the generation itself?
I was speaking more to the ratepayer benefits. Everybody benefits in some way, and if there's a benefit cost analysis out there that could be run on this, we'd all be in favor of that as well.
Okay. I was asking about the ratepayer benefit. I just didn't know if you meant, do ratepayers benefit? Like if I'm on the same circuit as a project, I don't feel like I benefit from the upgrade to the capacity of the circuit necessarily. But I wasn't sure if that's what you meant, or if you meant I'm benefiting from the project itself, from the clean generation coming online.
The latter.
Okay.
Yep. But again, I know that there's a lot of the RIM is out there. There's cost in 5340 about the PERS role in creating a benefit cost analysis. I mean, we'd be more comfortable if there was a cost benefit analysis involved in this as well.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you.
I suspect we'll be having a lot of additional discussion in this area. Mr. Lafayette, did you want to also respond to the chairman's question?
Yeah, I'll just bullet point in my speech just for clarity and efficiency. A lot of this is what often happens in Connecticut. Some precedent is set 20 years ago, and we all get stuck in it and keep trying to make that frame work. The idea of when someone builds a generating asset, solar or anything else, they instigated the need for the upgrade to the grid. So therefore, they pay 100%. That was a precedent set many, many years ago. That idea never anticipated the future that we are in now. It never anticipated electric vehicles, solar, heat pumps. It just didn't. So we keep operating within that frame, and it's time to mature out of it. I think that's one. Two, the cost sharing, as Mike discussed, we'd feel better if it was looked at or done analytically to see. And three, as a developer, and we've said this in documents and open testimony for years now, the state recruited solar development companies to come and build solar generating assets, not to revamp the grid, which is not our asset. That is held by Eversource and other parties. And we've said this. What's happening is there's this morphing into we are now responsible for upgrading Connecticut's grid. And that's just not true. That's not what we were recruited to do. That's not what the industry does. So, but we've morphed into that it's a given reality, and I want to kind of shake the tree on that a little bit. We've fallen into some just old thinking, and we haven't changed it, but now we need to because no one anticipated the future that we're in today. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Mr. Goodman, I apologize. You're up.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate it. I have two very brief comments and a question for the utilities. The comments quickly are one to the points in the presentation that the flexible and scheduled interconnection processes are still at essentially an early stage of development nationally. As explained in our comments, we agree with the approach of continuing to develop those processes through the working group and pilot projects so that it's more likely to succeed when it is more mature and ready for a broader deployment. Second, we appreciate the comment from Eversource earlier that acknowledged customer confidentiality concerns regarding data that could be shared on a time and seasonal varying level through the feeder. We think that the number of large manufacturing customers that have that particular concern is relatively small, and accommodating the concern shouldn't be burdensome for the developers who would seek access to likely other feeders. So appreciate the acknowledgement of that concern. Finally, the question for the companies is, I don't recall seeing an estimate of the potential costs for the ADMS and DERM systems. And I would just ask if they have even a ballpark illustrative estimate of the costs for those systems to deploy them now, in addition to the other costs that were identified in the presentation.
Anybody want to take that on at this point? We could also come back to it later. So yeah, I think let's keep track of that, ask the staff to, to raise that at the appropriate time. And at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Mr. Arpin. And so with his comments and reaction, and then he'll also take it from here. Thank you, Mr. Arpin.
Thank you, Commissioner Beecher. And I'd like to thank the EDCs for their time and presentation today, as well as the participation of all stakeholders that have asked questions so far. So I have a number of questions on the presentation today. I'm not sure I'll be able to get through all of them, but to start, I was wondering if the EDCs could please explain how a utility grid DERMS differs from the DERMS capabilities currently deployed today. I know that both EDCs use DERMS for the ESS program, for example. Specifically, what additional functionality or operational capability would a grid DERMS provide that the existing systems cannot? I don't know if Eversource wants to take that first.
Yeah, give us a second here. So the current DERM system really is used for conservation load management. And I'm not the expert in DERM system, but the grid is a real-time system. It looks at the real data, and it's a fundamental difference. You're looking at capacity and needs, and I'm not sure if anybody else at Eversource could give a better explanation, but fundamentally, they're not the same systems. A DERM system that we need for flexible interconnection is a real-time system. It's looking at real load, it's looking at real generation, and it comes up with actual data that's related directly to the circuit, as compared to what we have today is more for dispatching power based on power needs. Fundamentally, I'm not sure if anybody at UI or Eversource could expand on that.
I'll say it simpler is they have a similar name, but they're completely different systems that we're talking about. They're not at all related.
Okay, thank you for that response. Is anyone from UI still on that might be able to speak to that a little more?
Yeah, this is Zach Caruso from UI. What I can say is basically echoing a lot of what Eversource said, which is that the existing systems are really in the class of what we would call edge drones, in that they are built to dispatch edge assets, but they're not necessarily built today around taking in real-time operational data and responding to them in operationally meaningful timeframes based on that real-time data. They're more built around having a lot of warning and kind of things that are very much predetermined. So in that sense, a grid DERMS, similar to what we've implemented in the Connected IES, some of those programs does do that and allows us to fill that role. And I believe we went through in the proposal a number of the functions that we would require that would go into that grid DERMS to sort of lay that out and just give a sense of what that looks like.
Okay, thank you for that response. I have another question directed to specifically toward UI. I know UI is proposing a pilot program. So given that a pilot program would appear to require the deployment of a grid DERMS, would a pilot first approach meaningfully reduce overall ratepayer costs relative to, say, a system-wide deployment, or would a pilot increase total ratepayer costs if the authority went that route?
Yeah, so this is Zach again. I think that's hard to know at this point. A lot of the intent of the pilot approach is just to let us get our feet wet with the approach and kind of test out some of our assumptions to verify that they are accurate and they do work in a Connecticut environment before we went to that kind of full deployment and took on all those costs. The big reason behind that is that we don't want to roll something out that we think will work and is based on lessons learned we have in New York and lessons learned that we have in Connecticut, and then learn that some feature or another we missed a little bit, and then kind of have to roll that back because I think, as some of the developer stakeholders have mentioned, they want certainty, and so we very much want to try and come out with something here and roll something out that is, when we go to that full scale, that is as mature as possible so that we can know it will be successful. And that's the idea of a pilot, is that it kind of allows us to get that experience, make those learnings quickly, and then quickly move on to kind of that broader deployment so that we can get the value of this.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Caruso. Does Eversource have an opinion on that, about whether a pilot approach would meaningfully reduce ratepayer costs or potentially increase them versus a system-wide approach?
Give us 1 second, just seeing who might want to answer that.
If not, we can move on. If there's no one from Eversource that's able to answer that at this time. Another question that I have directed to both EDCs. I was wondering what technologies would be eligible for participation in flexible interconnection. I'm not sure the original motion specified the specific technologies. So specifically, I'm thinking about energy storage. Would that be eligible? And if not, why?
I don't think that we put a restriction on technology. So the idea is to be technology agnostic to the extent possible.
Okay, thank you. Is that the same for UI?
Yeah, good morning. This is Joe Marenka from UI. And yes, Chris, I would fully agree with what Joe said. The intent here would not be technology specific. This sort of functionality we would think at this point would apply to any technology-based project that would apply and would fit into the framework that we would be constructing here.
Okay, thank you for those responses. Another question I have, I know that one of the EDCs was mentioning the possibility of examining other alternatives to DER gateways. So I'm wondering whether there are lower cost technology alternatives to the traditional DER gateway integration that could still reliably support curtailment and flexible connection. Have the EDCs evaluated or discussed any of these alternative solutions?
So from an Eversource perspective, because of IT security concerns, our lower cost option would become available after the implementation of a DERMS. So that might be when we evaluate lower projects as well. The issue we have now is getting that data back to us in a safe and secure way.
You elaborate a little more on that about, it sounds like you'd have to wait until the DERMS is up and running before you can examine other technologies. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
So we're looking at 2030.5 right now, which is a protocol that would allow us with a DERMS to be able to communicate over public internet. Right now, we have to communicate over a secure communication channel, which goes on Eversource secure networks to get data back to our system from these gateways. So that's part of our issue with a lower cost gateway at this time, because we don't have a way to get the data back to us without an infrastructure put in place to be able to collect that data.
Okay, thank you for that response. Does UI have anything that they would like to add about potential alternative technologies in addition to the DER gateways?
Yes, and really it's similar to Eversource. We are aware of a potential need for a lower cost option. We're obviously always looking for ways to do things cheaper, to drive costs down. So that, but the challenge here is really the current system and the current approaches that we've used so far are really focused around larger assets. That's what we've done in New York. That's what a lot of the work in the UK has been kind of focused on. And so because of that, the solutions are very much built to be bulky with that in mind. So I don't think we disagree that there are potential ways to bring that down in size, and there's certainly options out there that we're starting to explore. It's just sort of a matter of understanding, one, where the line is on size, because I think we can probably all agree that there is a limit where we just don't want customers to have to worry about this if we can avoid it. And there's also a sweet spot in there where we probably need to get to a lower cost option. So understanding where that line is, and then how much smaller that solution needs to get, and then also kind of what the program constraints are, will actually drive a lot of that solution. So one of the things I'll just mention in New York, the threshold we're proposing is 50 kW. And the reason for that is that aligns with the process limits. There's a 50 kW fast track process. But we recognize that there's a gap there, but a lot of our capacity that we get is skewed much higher. So we don't get a lot of capacity in those ranges. And so it's something that we sort of still have to develop. But for those projects that are, I'll close out by saying, for projects that are that size, oftentimes the better solution is just to try and get them into existing capacity, right? So they don't have to curtail at all. And really, we think that in the proposal, that will hopefully handle most of this capacity. And part of the reason we want to pilot is that to see what where those situations come up and what exactly kind of get more on the ground experience with those customers on what their needs are.
Okay, thank you for that response, Mr. Trudeau. I have a follow-up question. So you mentioned that you're starting to explore alternative technologies and trying to better understand the line. Is there a timeline for when you would reach a conclusion on these alternative technologies?
There is not a firm timeline, but we like to think of things in a more agile approach. So it's kind of as we see the demand, then that helps us drive, and we have projects that helps us drive those requirements and those solutions for those specific solutions. It's a little bit more difficult to talk about something without having as much firm knowledge that yes, this is something that customers are seriously into at this scale, and these are their restrictions because there are significant like structural and engineering differences in how systems are architected at the megawatt plus scale versus in the we'll say 50 to 500 kW scale. That makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Crusoe. So I have another question. This is directed specifically toward Eversource. So it sounded like Eversource has a different curtailment approach than UI. It sounded like it was last in, first out because they're relying on the existing queue position. So I was wondering if Eversource could specifically comment on UI's proposed vintaging methodology and whether Eversource believes such an approach could provide a reasonable balance, between fairness, predictability, and operational feasibility. And if not, why?
The vintages discussion occurred late in the game. We haven't evaluated this, and it's something that probably can occur with a flexible interconnection, with a scheduled flexible interconnection, something that would be considered with a full DERM system. But we haven't evaluated this option at this point because it came up late in the game. It's in early stages.
Does Eversource have any initial thoughts on vintaging though, or is it still just evaluating it?
I think it needs further discussion at the work group before we present an opinion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Debs. So I have some other questions as well relating to curtailment. So these are directed to both EDCs. So I was wondering how the EDCs would validate the accuracy and reliability of their curtailment study process, particularly during early implementation when study methodologies are still evolving.
This is Joe Debs for Eversource. The accuracy of our study is critically important, and that's why we have increased the duration of the study, is to make sure that the data is accurate, especially in the early stages. We are requesting 120 business days to conduct the studies because we want to make sure the data is accurate.
Could UI speak to that as well? How they would validate the accuracy and reliability of their curtailment study process?
Yeah, this is Zach again. I would just say that as we've demonstrated in New York, we have a process and we can implement a process that would allow us to kind of dynamically track the curtailment from a site over time once it's implemented and compare that back to what the curtailment study was. I will say just 2 points that comparison is complex at times because one, our curtailment studies are meant to be conservative. We don't want to underestimate curtailment because that we see that as worse than overestimating it. And two, like the question of taking a site that is being curtailed and with the data that we have and current data structures, estimating what the output of that site would be if they weren't being curtailed is non-trivial and basically requires us to model the PV site in retrospect. And then the last point is that our curtailment estimates assume 100% uptime. And we all know that that's, while we would all love to have our PV sites up 100% of the time, that's not always true. And so those small changes, if you have a site with two flexible sites, or sorry, one flexible site, one firm site, and it's on the flexible site's on going to be curtailed, but the firm site is down on that day, then they're going to not see any curtailment. And that's great for them, but it makes our curtailment estimates look less accurate. So I think just to focus on what we're trying to get out of those curtailment estimates and that accuracy, I think is also important when we're kind of going into that effort.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So I have a follow-up here on this. So let's imagine a scenario where actual curtailment materially exceeds the levels estimated during the study process. What protections or remedies, if any, would exist for developers whose project financing or revenue assumptions relied on those initial study estimates?
I mean, my take from that is that that would need to be an established program through the authority or through any other public benefits sort of mechanism. The utility can't really backstop curtailment.
So essentially, like if you would have to curtail more, it would just be a cost to developers. If their initial curtailment study was inaccurate. Am I hearing you correctly?
Well, so from Eversource perspective, we're using a fixed schedule, so I think Zach may want to elaborate on the dynamic component.
Yeah, so this is Zach again. And I agree that I think right now the proposal as is does not go into those compensation mechanisms. As is, we don't want to shift burden onto ratepayers for these costs because we're trying to provide as much data as possible on these locations. We're also, for the pilot at least, we're also pre-screening them. And so our intent is that we are providing enough data to show that risk adequately so that those decisions can be made kind of with eyes wide open into that risk. But that we would not assume any of that risk if things were to change, such as if a large load were to leave, and then therefore that risk would not also slide into the papers.
All right, thank you, Mr. Caruso. Could you speak to what UI does in New York for their flexible dynamic interconnections there? If their curtailment analysis was inaccurate and projects had to be curtailed more than initially estimated?
Yes. So I will say that we have not encountered that scenario. So far, our curtailment estimates have been conservative, as I mentioned before, and the actual curtailment has been significantly below what we estimated. I will say, to follow that up, that the approach and the kind of what happens if is the same, and the answer is nothing. The risk is not on us as the utility.
So the risk would be, who would the risk be on specifically in that scenario if it were to happen in New York?
It's I don't know who ultimately bears the risk. I should say this, but ultimately the utility would not provide compensation for any extra curtailment over what was provided in the estimate.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So I have another question on a different topic here. So I know that in the interrog responses, both EDCs talked about scheduled flexible interconnections and that it would take several months to implement that. I also know that dispatch limiting schedules were previously approved for energy storage applications in the third and fourth annual ESS program reviews in docket numbers 230805 and 240805. So given this precedent, why couldn't scheduled flexible interconnections be implemented immediately using existing frameworks and infrastructure that are used for energy storage?
This Joe Debs, the intent is to use time series analysis for flexible interconnections. We haven't used time series analysis for battery schedules. That's a fundamental difference. So we're using minimum load and maximum generation to come up with our schedule based on the season, is what we're currently doing. Those are not, it's distinctly different from a time series analysis. Does this answer your question?
I think it does, yes. So it sounds like the dispatch limiting windows would be different and potentially the analysis would be different. Am I understanding?
The analysis would be more accurate and perhaps will allow more generation. But fundamentally, in a short run, we could conduct a study using the same criteria if we need to. We still need some time to make changes to our process, internal process, including Power Clerk, and some of the internal review process that we have to do. But there's a distinct difference between the two. Zach, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I don't want to I don't want to kind of speak too much for the Eversource team, but I think generally the idea here was not that we couldn't do schedules, which I think Rob outlined. It's that we felt like the best and most efficient thing was to go directly to flexible, which we feel provides much of the same, or much actually additional value over schedules, and would not require much additional work.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So I have another question about timeline. So I know that during the presentation you talked about the modeling complexity associated with flexible interconnection studies and the curtailment logic I was wondering whether the curtailment logic could potentially increase overall interconnection study timelines relative to the timelines used for firm interconnections, and if so, could the EDCs please estimate the expected timeline impact?
Are you referring to the study process?
Correct. And the complexity associated with the
Yes.
curtailment analysis, whether the timelines would be longer for flexible interconnections versus firm.
A firm interconnection are usually going to be easier. But as the number of flexible interconnections start being implemented, meaning if you have a substation that have both firm and flexible interconnection, you're likely to increase the complexity of the study regardless. And so that an increasing complexity means more time. That's one of the reasons we have 120 business days for the study and the guideline. How much time that would do is in the long run is a bit more complicated until we've done few of these studies. We would have a better assessment, but more likely that would make the studies a lot more complex when you start introducing flexible interconnections.
So
Generally speaking.
To follow up on that, so are you saying that then they would be longer because they're more complex?
That's a fair assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Well-
Does anybody have any additional input on that?
So agreed with Eversource that, and this is Zach from UI again, that the study timelines will likely be a little bit longer because we're adding additional complexity, we're adding additional studies. But I think the question on whether that will extend overall interconnection timelines is a question of what the sort of critical pathway to interconnection is. Something we've encountered in New York specifically is that that the limiting factor is not actually that study timeline. The limiting factor is often permitting and construction and a lot of other factors. So in that sense, we feel that generally, or we've experienced that generally in New York, if we add a little bit more time on the study, that would hopefully not extend overall interconnection timelines, because that would be absorbed in other processes while other processes were taking place in parallel. And I would also say that when we compare timelines for a flexible interconnection versus what it takes to upgrade a substation or upgrade a feeder, those construction timelines are often much longer and do stretch things out. So by avoiding that step and avoiding that upgrade, we do overall shrink those timelines. But again, it's sort of hard to make an equivalency. And I will go back to New York again, is because we don't have projects that are building those upgrades. So it's hard to say, okay, well, here's a project that built that upgrade. This is how long it took. And here's a project that went flexible. And here's how long that took. So we have B, but we don't really have A to kind of do that A to B. So those are some things to kind of consider when we talk about timelines.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So I have another question here, and I know the EDC spoke a little more generally about it during the presentation. I was wondering, how do the EDCs envision flexible interconnections being incorporated into long-term distribution planning processes, particularly with respect to deferring or avoiding ratepayer-funded infrastructure upgrades?
At this time, so from Eversource perspective, at this time, we don't anticipate an immediate impact on long-term system planning. The short-term impact. We actually expect it to be more complex, more difficult as we're managing a higher penetration of DER, and how that's going to impact our ability to potentially do certain projects. So whereas right now we might avoid capacity projects in a substation by shifting load, that might be impacted by increased DER penetration on a circuit that we can no longer move without additional costs associated with that. So we do see those complexities coming in. And we outlined a long-term vision where hopefully if this program develops to a point where there is appropriate alignment between developers, the authority, and the utility, we might be able to lever these resources. But again, I think that comes back down to a compensation question. If we're using them for capacity, then as a capacity asset that we can depend on, I guess the question comes down to who's paying for that, right? So there's still a ratepayer impact to use these as a capacity asset. So that's a complex future vision, but as of right now, it's not going to reduce costs from Eversource's perspective for capacity or substation related projects.
Does UI have anything that they would like to add? And then I do have a follow-up question on that.
Hey, Chris, this is Joe Marenka from UI. Our future outlook on this relative to the IDSP is very much aligned with how Steve described it for Eversource. Whereas in the near term, it will add some level of complexity to existing circuit or substation modeling that goes on during that process. But I do agree that there are potentially opportunities, and Steve touched on this as well, regarding how much interest, how much success this program may achieve over time. There are potentially opportunities to weave this into what I do understand is a somewhat of a changing environment for the future of long-term planning for utilities. So.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So my follow-up is, so let's imagine a scenario, say like multiple years in the future, let's just say 5 to 10 years in the future, where there are many flexible interconnection projects, dynamic flexible interconnection projects across both EDC territories. Would the EDCs expect in that circumstance the ratepayer-borne cost of flexible interconnections, such as grid-scale DERMS and so forth, would be at least partially offset through the deferral or avoidance of ratepayer-funded infrastructure upgrades? Why or why not?
Again, from an Eversource perspective, because these are not under our operational control, we can't factor them in as an offset for capacity. So at this time, with the current structure around this program that we're aware of as far as a regulatory structure or any other mechanism to use these assets to benefit ratepayers, we don't have an answer to that any further as to how that could offset capacity projects.
Do I have anything that they would like to add to that question?
So similarly, and Joe Marenka, UI, similarly, I don't believe we can answer that question today. At minimum, I think it's probably makes sense to have it as part of the further discussion on this topic, and on a program such as this moving forward, because it can play absolutely can play a role, but to my understanding, that level of detail has not been broached yet with the discussions. So.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to a different topic here. Staying on costs, though, I was wondering if you could speak to the relative advantages or disadvantages of recovering some flexible interconnection costs through RAM as opposed to a future distribution rate case. I know that EDCs were mentioning possibly recovering them through the NBMCC, so I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the advantages and disadvantages of that.
So I think I think recovering the costs through the RAM in between rate cases is to allow the most flexibility for a new program or new costs that weren't contemplated at the time of a rate case. So it allows something, a new program or a new cost that wasn't part of the previous rate case to move forward. So that is the key advantage. Is that it allows something to move forward uh, until the next rate case, at which time those costs can be rolled into the rate case.
So to follow up on that, are you suggesting that the project wouldn't be able to get moved forward if they weren't recovered through an annual reconciling mechanism?
I think the EDCs, the cost recovery is something that should happen contemporaneously with projects. So if it was not part of the previous rate case, I believe that there needs to be a mechanism to recover those costs until they can be folded into the next rate case.
Okay, thank you. Does UI have anything that they would like to add to that point?
Chris, give me 1 second while I consult with their UI folks here.
Sure. In the meantime, while UI is consulting, maybe I'll ask another question to Eversource on this, and then possibly have UI weigh in. So I know in the motion number 18 ruling in docket number 230805, the authority directed the EDCs to include in their next rate case applications a detailed plan for the procurement of a centralized DERMS platform. So given this existing authority directive, why should the costs associated with centralized DERMS deployment for flexible interconnection not be reviewed and recovered through each EDC's next base distribution rate case proceeding?
Chris, I'll try to chime in here, and it's unfortunately it's going to be a very high level response because cost recovery is not my area of expertise here. But I think in general, from UI's perspective, we need to have timely cost recovery, and whether that means however that plays relative to a rate case or the RAM proceeding. From our perspective, we would be looking for some aspect of an approved timely mechanism to recover capital costs that are outlaid for a program like this.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Marenkas. So going back to my other question, perhaps Eversource could speak to this. So, again, I know there is an existing authority directive in motion number 18 and 230805 about a centralized DERMS platform being recovered through a distribution rate case. So given this existing authority order, why shouldn't these costs be recovered through a distribution rate case? Perhaps Mr. Shelnitz, if you want to speak to that, possibly.
Can you just repeat the question, Mr. Harper?
Yes. So in motion number 18 ruling in docket number 230805, the authority had directed both EDCs to include in their next rate case applications a detailed plan for the procurement of a centralized DERMS platform. This centralized DERMS platform would also be needed, of course, for a flexible interconnection. So given this overlap, why would the DERMS deployment cost not be recovered through a base distribution rate case?
So it's my understanding that although that various parts of the program will have been presented, I don't believe the costs have been fully modeled to be included in the case at this point.
Okay, thank you. So to clarify, are you saying that Eversource is not intending to include a centralized DERMS in its rate case filing this summer?
Just give me 1 second. I'm getting something from one of the SMEs.
No worries.
Okay, so they will be, but they won't be in service, so that's why they wouldn't be in the rate case proposal, because they wouldn't be in service, those costs.
Okay, thank you for that response. A couple more questions on cost here. So I was wondering to what extent the EDCs could leverage existing systems or operational experience from affiliate jurisdictions where flexible interconnection or grid-scale DERMS have been implemented, to potentially reduce implementation cost. In Connecticut, I know Eversource was talking about affiliate territories in Massachusetts examining flexible interconnection, and UI was referring to its affiliate in New York having implemented flexible interconnection on a pilot scale. But I'm wondering if these existing systems could be leveraged to reduce the cost for Connecticut.
Yeah, this is Zach from UI again. I'll jump in real quick to say that yes, we are leveraging lessons learned. I believe we filed the intermediate summary report from our New York project, which goes through a lot of those. And so a lot of the lessons learned and the experiences we've had in New York help us roll things out quicker and kind of skip some of those early storming stages and kind of frankly, like jump quicker to something that is viable and that we can scale quicker. So that naturally helps reduce costs. But want to be clear that Connecticut needs its own dedicated system for both and IT and OT reasons of separation, and also for we don't want anyone kind of leeching off of other states' ratepayers. So there are some synergies, and it definitely will. Our experiences will definitely help us kind of reduce costs, but we can't use the same system.
Okay, thank you. Would Eversource like to speak to that point as well?
Yes, we can mirror the response from Zach there. I believe our Massachusetts operating company is not as far ahead as UI's New York company, but yes, we do intend to lever where we can, but same thing, we do have to keep, of course, rate base separate between the two as far as assets are concerned.
So to follow up on that, specifically to UI and the terms that's being used in New York, so why couldn't, using that or modifying the contract, let's say, to cover multiple territories, why couldn't that reduce costs, both for Connecticut and for New York ratepayers? I know you're saying you don't want to shift costs from one territory to the other, but, applying that contract to multiple, why couldn't it reduce costs?
So this is Zach again. It definitely could. And the reason we don't know for sure is I'll say that the contracts we have in place that we have used so far in New York do exist. And I'll say loosely they can be applied to Connecticut. But as we talk about scaling something, and as we talk about full DERMS, we do need to think about kind of a bigger and broader, deeper solution. And I think that's some of what the DERM strategy plan in that other proceeding that you mentioned will likely go to. And so, the short answer is that it very well might, but that's not something that we can conclusively say that the two of them together will definitely save us money.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Caruso. I have another question on a different cost. So I know that there are costs associated with DRR gateways that will be borne by developers. Is there any way to decrease the cost for those, by leveraging learnings from other EDC sister territories, Massachusetts and New York? And if so, could the EDCs please speak to that?
So for an Eversource perspective, this is what I had brushed on before. So we are doing a pilot in Mass right now to look at 2030.5, which is a protocol that allows us to use public internet-based communications. And that is a Massachusetts-based pilot that we intend to lever for Connecticut as well.
Okay, thank you. Does UI have anything that they would like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just say, this is Zach again, that anything we develop in one territory, we think should be pretty easily ported over. Now, I just go briefly back to the fact that they are different systems, different utilities with different architectures on the back end, so that it's not purely one-to-one, but 100%. If we have a solution, we have success with it. I see no reason why we couldn't explore kind of how that would apply to Connecticut and how we could help bring costs down.
Okay, thank you for those responses. I have a follow-up question to an earlier question that Mr. Goodman had about the cost estimates for this program. So I know that in the original motion, it seemed like UI had more detailed cost estimates than Eversource, but even UI's cost estimates included some uncertainty. So I was wondering, for both EDCs here, how long would the EDCs need to develop complete and finalized cost estimates for a flexible interconnection program, recognizing, of course, that there would need to be more development, authority orders, and so forth. But how much time would the EDCs need to develop more complete estimates on this? And again, either EDC can take that.
At this time, Eversource doesn't have an answer for that. I think we need to have a better understanding of the program, of exactly how full flexible interconnections will be implemented in Connecticut.
Does UI have anything that they would like to add?
Similarly, and Joe Marenka from UI, similarly, I was going to say I think a lot of it is going to depend on what the program and the scope of what we're estimating will need to include. So I think those furthering these discussions in the working groups and or with the Pure decision on how the EDCs move forward, whether it's with the pilot or with some other proposed approach, I think will certainly dictate the amount of time we would need to feel comfortable with the proper level of detail for an estimate.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So I just have a couple more questions here. I know that we are over time, and then we'll turn to Grid Edge, but just a couple more questions. I know that the EDCs had talked about flexible interconnection eligible location designations. I was wondering how frequently those would be updated and potentially published on the EDC's hosting capacity maps. Would it be like every month, or would it be a greater timeline?
Yeah, so I can jump in on this. This is Zach again. I think loosely in the proposal, we didn't kind of have a firm interval that we were targeting with that. I would say loosely, as we kind of get more comfortable with flexible interconnection and get a better understanding of what makes a good eligible location, I see no reason why we couldn't somewhat automate the assessment process to allow us to update that more dynamically. But I will also mention loosely that a big part of the FIEL idea is that it would be centered around, or would have a manual review component, because part of the idea is that we are looking at these places and we are saying, yes, confirm this is a good place for flexible interconnection, because there's not other constraints or other issues out there that are going to stand in our way and make flexible interconnection not viable. Because and the intent of that is that we would like to limit the amount of time we spend chasing down sort of non-viable locations. So the extent to which we can head that off at the beginning, we feel that that's helpful and helps kind of keep the efficiencies here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Caruso. Does Eversource have anything that they would like to add to that?
At this point, we haven't made a decision on how frequently that will be done.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Debs. So my final question here, I know in the final slide, the EDCs had talked about the flexible interconnection working group. I was wondering whether the EDCs intend to continue convening and participating in this working group absent additional authority direction. I know that the decision's tentatively scheduled to come out in October, or would a formal authority order be required, to continue the work that's been ongoing there?
Joe Marenka for UI. I'll try to take a stab at this. I don't believe we would need an order from the authority to continue. I think it is a top at to a certain degree, the orders on this topic that have already been in place. I think sort of paint that path forward. Part of the intention of the interconnection working groups, just that in general, is to identify topics like this and have detailed discussions around possibilities of implementing technologies and or programs such as this. So to me, I believe it already falls under the construct of what the interconnection working groups are in place to do. But again, that's also just an opinion on my part. If the authority wishes to provide an order on it, then that's also well within your rights to do so. But from my perspective, I believe we would plan on continuing the conversation.
Right. I agree with Joe Marenka. In fact, we scheduled the first meeting next June without requirements, and we will continue doing so as part of the work group effort to simplify interconnection in the state of Connecticut. So we've already taken the steps to move forward with the work group.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So those are all my questions to the EDC. So again, I thank the EDCs for their time and for answering all my questions today. And now I'd like to turn to Nakam Sadan from Grid Networks, an IES grant recipient who will discuss a distributed substation DERMS approach to flexible interconnection as an alternative to the EDC's centralized DERMS model. So the floor is yours, Grid Networks, and let us know if you would like Mr. Bumpin to pull up the slides or whether you would like to control them yourself.
Thank you, Chris, and hello, everyone. My name is Nahum Sadan, and I'm the founder and CEO of Grid Networks. Let me put up the slides so I can control them. Oh, can you enable sharing for me, please?
That should be all set now.
Thank you.
Robin, we can't see the screen.
I believe Mr. Sadan will be putting them up in one moment.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm having difficulties. Can you put up my slides?
Yes, sir.
So while the slides are coming up, yes, thank you. So again, I'm Nahum Sadan, founder and CEO of Grid Networks. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments in response to EDC filings on flexible interconnection. I would also like to thank the EDCs for their presentations this morning. GridEdge is developed and field tested jointly with Avangrid, a distributed Flex IX solution that I would like to share with you today. It is a local solution operating between a distribution substation and edge DER. It can be immediately deployed in congested substations without a rate case and without costly and lengthy overbuilds. Before I start, I would like to frame the problem we're trying to solve here. Unlocking grid capacity. To be clear, capacity constraints are not a physical problem. There's plenty of unused capacity in today's grid. It is a policy problem. This is the good news. Since it is a policy problem, it can also be fixed by changing the policy. This is the main driver for FlexIX, a software technology that unlocks existing grid capacity, deferring hardware buildouts. A recent cost-benefit analysis study of FlexIX commissioned by NYSERDA concludes that New York State can unlock over 1 gigawatt of unused capacity and save the New York ratepayer over $1 billion with FlexIX. I would highly recommend getting a copy. This is the real motivation and why we're having this meeting today. Now the question is, how do we enable FlexIX in Connecticut as quickly and economically and as reliably as possible? Next slide, please. Before I answer this question, I would like to take a minute to give you a quick overview of Grid Edge Networks. We are a Massachusetts technology company with a mission to advance clean energy and transportation electrification by specifically addressing the grid interconnection challenge using innovative, flexible technology solutions. Our work has been recognized and funded by 5 grants from NYSERDA, Mass Clean Energy Center, and your own Connecticut IES program. Thank you so much for selecting Grid Edge in Cycle 1 of the Innovative Energy Solutions Program. It is very much appreciated. And special thanks go to Avangrid for partnering with Grid Edge and guiding the development and testing of the DERCOM product. Grid Edge is not a newcomer in the DR interconnection field. We've been making contributions to the IEEE interconnection standard for over 10 years and have a history of field deployments of our DGP product with multiple utilities in over 80 substation projects. Next slide, please. DERCOM is the name of the platform I will be presenting today. It took 5 years in development and field testing in Connecticut and New York to validate its performance and functionality. The first NYSERDA grant, Pond 4074 here, was used to develop the base platform with a single solar PV use case. The second grant, Pond 4393, was used to extend the platform for more use cases, including energy storage, EV charging, and hybrid combinations. And the 2-year IES project that was just completed 3 months ago successfully demonstrated V2G with an electric school bus. Next slide, please. You're looking at photos of various field installations of pilot projects in Connecticut and New York. I would like to emphasize that the same DERCOM platform that was used for V2G, as shown in the center photos here, was also used to enable flexible interconnection of solar PV and energy storage DER. Next slide, please. This slide contains the FlexIX options that the EDCs filed in April. With both options, a centralized DERMS or a stepped approach with scheduled first and then DERMS, PURA is being asked to approve a rate case, as highlighted in bold. I'm here to present a third option that does not require PURA to approve a rate case. DERCOM is a third option that enables dynamic flexible interconnection at a lower cost than even a scheduled interconnection. So to Chris's question, this is an alternative technology that can be considered in Connecticut. Next slide, please. So what is DERCOM? It is a new class of an OT system that can be defined as substation DERMS. It is a turnkey system that includes a substation controller named DDERM. If I had a pointer, I would have pointed to the box that says DDERM there. Edge devices named EDERM. You can see 3 of them. And integrated secured communications between the substation and the edge. It comes with full DER integration at the edge. Supports multiple DER types. You can see the icons, solar energy storage and EVs. And exposes a single SCADA interface to the utility management system. And that's on the left of the DDERM, connecting to a utility control center. It comes with full DER integration at the edge, supports the multiple DER types, and it can run with or without DERMS. The brain of the system are the closed loop control algorithms that run on the DDERM in the substation and continuously monitor and control all edge DER assets attached to the feeders emanating from the substation. The algorithms detect grid constraints and trigger a DER action at the edge, such as curtailment, but not only limited to curtailment, and ensure grid safety until the grid constraint is removed. This is done in real time with sub-second response time. DERCOM is also acting as a middle layer between the utility and the customer DER, providing enhanced cybersecurity protection. Next slide, please. Let's break down the scheduled interconnection and compare it to a dynamic, flexible interconnection with DERCOM. The scheduled approach, as we heard from Joe Debs, is simple and effective for a single DER. It uses an edge device like a DER gateway or an RTAC with pre-programmed schedules that ensure that the DER operates within certain limits. Since it is an edge-only device, it costs much less than a centralized DERMS and does not require a rate case. However, its simplicity is also its weakness. Where this approach breaks down is with multiple DER and various DER types. Each will require a customized RTAC with no coordination between them. And the scheduled approach is not that efficient. It enforces limits even at times when grid capacity is available and there are no constraints, resulting in excess curtailments of 18 to 25%. While the dynamic approach only curtails 1 to 3% for the same conditions. It also is not scalable, requiring customer integration and troubleshooting at the edge if things don't work well. The total cost for a developer of a scheduled interconnection is not only the $75K that Joe quoted. The $75K is the cost of the RTAC and the programming, but there's also a plant controller and fiber that the utility requires between the RTAC and the plant controller. So the cost for a developer is around $100,000 to $110,000. While the DERCOM solution, comes with full system integration and implementation and is less than $100,000. The cost difference grows even to 2x for subsequent DER projects out of the same substation. So once the DDERM is installed at a substation, the second, third, and subsequent projects only pay for the edge device, the EDERM, and that cost is $50,000. So here you have a solution that enables dynamic flexible interconnection at a lower cost than scheduled. Let's do a quick calculation together. 10% of congested substations amount to about 20 substations. If we prime all of them by installing a DDERM in each, the total cost will be $1 million. Now, any new DER project will only cost $50,000 in interconnection costs. The cost of a scheduled interconnection with an RTAC stays flat at $100,000, since each project is done individually. There's no argument that dynamic is more efficient than scheduled, but so far, dynamic Flex IX has always been associated with enterprise DERMS, raising legitimate concerns of high cost and long deployment time. But what if there is another solution, dynamic solution, that is currently available for immediate project deployment and costs less than even a scheduled solution? And if you allow me just a segue here, the term scheduled flexible interconnection is a bit of a misnomer. The scheduled are not flexible. The scheduled are static. So there are only two categories, really, static and dynamic. So dynamic requires real-time control, while static with schedules that are pre-programmed do not require that. Next slide, please. Now let's compare distributed DERCOM with centralized DERMS. They're both fundamentally and architecturally different and serve different functions. DERMS, or an ADMS extension, is an enterprise IT system that excels in system-wide monitoring, forecasting, and planning. It is not a real-time control system. The 10% congested substations in Connecticut require a localized real-time OT system that can unlock capacity with flexible interconnection software at a fraction of the cost of a full-blown DERMS and without having to wait for a rate case. And there was a question that I believe Chris asked earlier. What is the ballpark of a DERMS system? And we didn't hear an answer for that question. So I will volunteer based on numbers that I've seen in other states. The cost of a DERMS system, including integration, would be millions to tens of millions of dollars. So that's sort of the ballpark we're looking at. Bottom line, with a centralized DERMS approach, we need to wait for its full integration before even the first DR project can benefit from FlexIX. With a distributed DERCOM approach, there's no need to wait as we deploy one substation at a time. Next slide, please. So DERCOM has benefits to all Connecticut stakeholders. It is a win-win all around. Utilities, starting from the left, utilities get a field-tested OT solution that manages grid constraints in real time with sub-second response time and fail-safe reliability. It relieves pressure to free up resources to work on big strategic transmission projects and addresses the distribution congestion points where the pain is located, namely at the substation. Developers are able to deploy more DER projects quickly with minimal curtailment, translating to millions of dollars in added revenue. Regulators are able to meet their state policy goals of clean energy and transportation electrification with no added cost to ratepayers. And ratepayers benefit from clean energy and EV programs without experiencing a rise in their electric bills. DERCOM is an affordability solution for DER interconnection. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. In summary, I presented a third option that enables dynamic flexible interconnection without DERMS and at a lower cost than scheduled. It has no impact on the ratepayer and is a no risk, no regrets investment for the utility. DERCOM deploys quickly without a complex and lengthy IT integration process and can be prioritized by a substation location. Closing the loop where we started. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Only 10% of total substations are affected. High DR penetration is not present everywhere. And similarly, so is the case with large EV loads. So the real question is, why can't we address those specific locations? First, while taking time in parallel to work on longer-term system upgrades, such as transmission lines. It may take years before penetration levels rise higher, and maybe they won't rise any further. Let's solve today's immediate problem with an affordable and practical solution that works for all stakeholders and provides an optimal technical and financial solution. In closing, I would like to thank the Commission for the opportunity to speak today and end with a call to action. Would PURA and the EDCs consider a third option for flexible interconnection? Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Guess it's time for questions.
Commissioner Cheeseman.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, who pays for this?
Excellent question, Commissioner Cheeseman. Similar to the existing process where the DER developer that triggers the requirement, the project that triggers the requirement pays for this. So as I mentioned, The cost is anywhere between $50,000 to $100,000, which is affordable even for smaller projects.
Thank you.
And I also should have thanked you for your presentation. We really appreciate having your perspective. Anybody else looking? I know that Mr. Arpin will have some follow-up. Mr. Arpin?
Thank you, Commissioner Beecher, and thank you, Mr. Sadan, for your presentation and input today on an alternative solution here. So I have several questions for Grid Edge Network. So my first question is, I know you mentioned the IES pilot that you participated in. I was wondering if Grid Edge Networks could please describe the scope and objectives of the IES pilot, including how it may have related to flexible interconnection, as well as whether the pilot achieved its intended operational outcomes.
Yes, absolutely. So the pilot, for those who have not read the summary report or not familiar with the details, the pilot was to demonstrate vehicle-to-grid technology with an electric school bus. The Grid Edge partnered with UI and with ACES, Area Cooperative Education Services, a private school bus operator that owns and operates an electric school bus. And the intent or the objective was to create a template for a cooperation between a utility and a school bus or an EV fleet, rather, operator. So as far as meeting the objectives, I would say yes, we demonstrated taking the customer through the DER interconnection process, which is not a simple feat for those who went through this process. And for those who read the report, we encountered some challenges along the way, and we solved or worked around those challenges in order to demonstrate the technology. And along the way, we found we documented these challenges, and we documented the lessons learned and provided recommendations. So I would say from that perspective, the pilot was successful because it uncovered challenges that I'll just name a couple. For example, it was not clear to us when we started the project that there will be a limitation that this particular site had solar co-located with the electric school bus. And then I'm mentioning it since this is a policy issue. The customer was not receptive to affecting their solar renewable energy credits when and if the electric school bus is discharging to the grid. So we had to work around that. That this was I would say, one of the big lessons. And again, another was, and again, the report talks about that in great detail, is the interoperability at the edge. In order to enable V2G, we had to work with not only the charger vendor, but also with the electric school bus manufacturer in order to interoperate the different communication standards, and without getting into too much into the technology details. But the bottom line was the ACES bus was not capable of doing V2G, so I had to bring loaner buses. And the first loaner did not work. So only the third bus actually worked for us. So I would say, yes, all the learnings, and they're not specific just for Connecticut, right? But Connecticut sort of led the way, but all these learnings are very important. And that's why I recommended to Pura not to move on to scalability, because this technology is not ready for scalability for statewide deployment. I recommended deploying more pilot projects until we uncover all these issues and continue our learning process. Again, we only tested with one charger. We need to test with more chargers, with more electric school buses, with not only school buses, also with different fleet types. So I'll stop here. I hope
Okay,
that
thank
answered
you
your
for
question.
that response, Mr. Sadan. So wondering if the EDCs could please speak more broadly about their experience working with grid edge networks to date in the IES program, including any lessons learned. Not sure if the relevant SME is on from the IES program, but if they are, if you could please speak to experience with working with grid edge networks.
Yeah, this is Zach from UI. We weren't directly involved or I wasn't directly involved in the pilot, but I can say in support what Malcolm was saying, we were able to successfully deploy it on UI system and demonstrate that the system functioned as designed. I will add that, it wasn't a real flexible interconnection, and it was focused on V2G, as Malcolm mentioned.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Caruso. So going back to grid edge networks, I was wondering how mature grid edge network substation term solution is, specifically, you spoke a little about this, but specifically like where has the technology been tested or deployed to date, and what were the operational results so far?
Yes, thank you for the question. And just to follow up to Zach's point, the same, and I alluded that in my slides. It's the same platform has been used for V2G, the V2G demonstration. It's the same platform that's being used also for flexible interconnection. And we have run this platform for 3 years in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with a Avangrid owned solar site, and now we have an installation in downstate New York with a customer 2 MW solar site. And as far as lessons learned, I think I could say based on data that we measured that the system works as designed. A recent experience actually in the New York substation. And this you cannot actually plan in a test plan, but we tested the resiliency of the system. They had an outage of 14 hours at the substation that brought down the solar site, brought down our equipment, of course, and we detected that in our monitoring. And sorry about that, phone call. We detected that in our monitoring, and we reported that to NYSEG. We also reported that to the solar customer. And after the outage was fixed, the system came up and resumed monitoring as designed.
Okay, thank you. And so to clarify, Mr. Sadan, these other projects in New York and so forth, were these specifically flexible interconnection projects, or were they V2G similar to the IES?
Those were flexible interconnection projects.
Okay, thank you.
The only V2G project was in Connecticut in North Haven.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
again, I just want to jump in there. This is Zach. To just be clear that they weren't operational flexible interconnection projects. They were simulated.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Crusoe. Another question here to grid edge networks specifically. I was wondering what limitations currently exist, if any, currently exist with respect to supported DER technologies or use cases regarding grid edge networks DERMS platform. Specifically, are there any interconnection scenarios or grid conditions for which this solution would not be appropriate?
That's a good question, Chris. I cannot think of any at this point. Again, because we're bringing the intelligence to the substation. So actually, one of the questions earlier, and I'm sorry, I'm taking a segue, but I'll get back to your question. One of the questions earlier was about or challenges of DERMS was the long communication lines and the need to bring the data back to the control center. Well, you actually eliminate that by bringing the intelligence and the decision-making closer to where the action is, to the substation. So there is no concern of bringing the data up to a control center because all the decisions are local and all the data gathering is local. So we make decisions based on measurements, not based on modeling and estimations. And that therefore the decisions are more accurate. So as far as use cases, we tested so far, solar PV, energy storage in limited capacity, the V2G, of course, which was completed, and energy storage, which we will be testing this year, and EV charging. So I believe and we're going to do combinations of these different technologies. So I believe our goal is to use one platform for all these use cases. And just by having different software loads on the same platform, we can address new use cases. And the architecture is modular. So if a new use case comes up that we, in the future, let's say 5 years from now, we can address that, by adding software to the platform.
Okay, thank you. So to follow up on that, so to clarify, there aren't any known limitations, but Grid Edge Networks is still conducting ongoing testing in certain scenarios?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question on timeline here. So I was wondering how long, it took Grid Edge Networks to deploy its platform in Connecticut, in other projects such as the UI Solar project you mentioned, or for the IES pilot, and how do these real-world deployment experience timelines, compare to the estimated 2 to 6 month implementation timeline presented here today?
I love this question because I can talk from experience in Connecticut. It actually took a day to install the equipment at the substation. We did that in the morning, and then in the afternoon went to the ACES site and installed and commissioned the equipment at the customer site. So we usually say 6 weeks, but we can do it much faster than that. And the same thing at the solar site in Tustin, New York. It was done in a day. In that case, it was actually reversed. In the morning, we installed the EDRM at the solar site, and in the afternoon, the EDRM at the substation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sedan. So I have a question about cost here. Specifically, what cost would the EDCs be likely to incur to support your substation DERMS approach, including testing, integration, operational support or maintenance? I know that they do incur costs for all of the pilots in the IES program, for example, including yours. I was wondering if you could speak to the cost that the EDCs might incur for this technology.
Well, I cannot speak for the EDCs. I'll just give you my perspective, and the EDCs can jump in as well. So it really depends on the level of integration that the EDCs would like to employ with our solution. The DERCOM system can operate autonomously. It does not require DERMS or SCADA master in order to monitor and run the closed loop control algorithms. Now, if the utility would like to use a SCADA master to get alarms and alerts from the DERCOM system, or if they already have a DERMS, they can use DERCOM as a proxy and push SCADA commands through the DDERM in the substation down to the EDERMs and sort of override the automatic DER control. They can do that. So in that case, they will need to connect to an RTU, for example, or connect to another, SCADA master, and it's an ADMS or EDRMs. Now, in order to get inputs from the substation, we We usually try to get voltage to detect an overvoltage or undervoltage condition, and current to detect the thermal constraint. We would need to connect to a meter, which we did in the UI substation, and we're doing it in an RG&E substation, or use a 2411 device to connect to the actual CTs and PTs in a substation in New York where there was no control room. It was a bare bone substation where we needed to do that. So in that case, the Grid Edge brings the 2411, and Grid Edge does the interconnections, but the utility, NYSEG had to install the equipment and connect and do the wiring to for that specific use case. So yes, there's work for the utility. I cannot estimate their cost. Suffice to say that I just said, it took 4 hours to do that, to do the wiring at the Lexington Lake substation. But perhaps
Yeah, thank you for that response, Mr. Sadan. So I'll
someone
open
else
it
can.
to the EDCs. If you could please, Eversource and UI, speak to potential costs that you would incur, hypothetically, if this solution were adopted, as well as, the current technological and operational capabilities that you have to support alternative solutions like this. If you could please speak to that a little more.
So from an Eversource perspective, though, we'd have to evaluate this technology in more detail. We do believe we already have the best path chosen forward with a centralized system. From this presentation, we're not sure that it eliminates the need for that centralized system when we look at costs or repairs. Another cost that we were concerned about, I brought up earlier in my presentation or in the questions you had for me about long-term system planning. Our understanding of what I saw today is that this could increase some of our system planning costs. Namely, if it sounds like this is a device that's put at a substation. So if we shift load, move loads between substations, I guess the counter question is does then each substation there on forward as we do capacity projects to try and mitigate more expensive capacity projects, do we then have to coordinate with a separate vendor to be able to do switching and manage customer loads where we can do that otherwise with the proposals we have in place?
Could you speak a little more, before getting UI's thoughts about why a substation DERMS approach wouldn't reduce the need or eliminate the need for a centralized DERMS system if flexible interconnections were allowed?
So I guess it depends on which perspective we're looking at. So again, from a planning perspective, keep in mind, we don't plan a DER asset out of a single substation. We may have to plan it out of an alternate feed. And then we also have to consider any emergent or other scenarios of how will this asset handle if we have to remove them from either of those substations. We wouldn't be able to coordinate with that. But it also goes to my point before about if this isn't a centralized planned asset that we can use within our system, it would be very difficult to implement this into any kind of capacity-based planning that we were talking about as a long-term vision.
Okay, thank you. Does UI have anything that they would like to add to that?
Sorry, just one other point is that this decentralized component is essentially what we're doing with our DER gateway at the moment. So like I said, we have to evaluate the technology a little bit further to see the differences between there. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll go. This is Zach from UI. Just to say that, I think what Eversource described there is more or less accurate. I'll say that the effort here is not just the time in the substation to integrate the solution. There's engineering time, there's project management time that goes into that. So, having to replicate that at every substation you do this on is definitely something that we want to be clear, and you have to kind of look at your costs versus your benefits for that, especially when if you can provide a lot of that same functionality via existing data that is already being streamed into a centralized location, then we have to be very clear on the value of that for that specific use case. And I'll just add that, to be clear, from our perspective, we do not support operating something like this in the blind, for reasons that Steve Osich mentioned, and also for reasons that, operationally, these flexible interconnections are protecting critical grid assets. And so we need that operational supervision and that feedback to ensure that things are operating as expected, and to take operational action if something does go wrong. And that's built into that's built into our strategy that we kind of rolled out in the proposal.
Okay, thank you for those responses.
Chris, can I jump in and?
Yes, I was just about to give you.
I would like to answer your question. Before we move on to a new question, these are two different aspects. DERCOM, or substation DERMS, is not a grid capacity planning tool, while DERMS is. So we're comparing oranges to apples. So the substation DERMS is not a substitute to an ADMS or DERMS. It's a local solution to solve the existing and immediate need in the most cost-effective way. Now, for grid capacity planning, there are other solutions. This is not the topic today.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So those are all my questions for Grid Edge Networks and the EDCs today. So again, I thank everyone for their time and participation, and I turn it back to Commissioner Beecher, who I believe will turn to public comments.
Thank you so much, Mr. Arpin, and to Grid Edge and our utility participants and everybody else. Do we have any members of the public or other stakeholders who would like to offer some comments or perspective at this time? Everybody's getting hungry for lunch. So any last commissioner comments or questions? All right, I'm not seeing any. So yeah, I think we'll wrap up now. Grab my notes. I just want to thank everybody for participating today. I think this is a really beneficial discussion. I think we learned a lot. I think we still have, maybe we still have some way to go on our learning curve. I know I do, in this area. But I want to thank as I said, thank all of the participants. I want to thank the working group on this, or in the ongoing work of the Pure staff, because I think they've been incredibly supportive of the commission, the authority in looking at this, and we appreciate all their efforts. I think, as you know, from some of our comments and questions, that the commissioners are going to be keenly interested in issues around cost allocation and cost recovery. So bear that in mind. Those are obviously issues that we always care about, and we'll keep inquiring about those. So as a reminder, the next anticipated procedural step in this proceeding is the issuance of interrogatories tentatively scheduled for June 10th, 2026, with responses due on June 24th, 2026. So that's a fairly tight timeline. And the proposed final order proposed final decision is tentatively scheduled for issuance on September 1st, with written exceptions due 2 weeks later on September 15th. So again, the authority's final decision is scheduled for October 7th of this year. So without any further questions or concerns, let me double check. There we go. I guess with that, thank you one last time, and we'll close out this technical meeting. We're adjourned. Thank you.